Welcome to Chapter 9 and the science behind habits. This is one of my favorite chapters because in this chapter, we're going to geek out on all things science and all things habits. And this chapter is really going to make it very clear about why we have habits and also how you can break and create new habits. So excited. Back in the day, back in the late 1800s, a scientist named Ivan Pavlov actually discovered the power of habits by training his dog to drool at the sight of someone entering the lab in a lab coat and also at the ringing of a bell. So the dog associated the sight of a lab coat and the ringing of a bell with getting fed. So he started to drool. Now, over the last 100+ years since then, we've learned so much more about habits. So habits are formed in our brain to actually help us conserve energy. And a habit in the brain is actually called a habit loop. And it actually consists of 5 different elements: cue, craving, routine, reward, and result. And so let me briefly explain each of these 5 elements. So the first element is cue. This is the trigger to our brain to tell us that something is about to happen. The craving is when the trigger occurs, we begin to crave something, like that particular thing that trigger has triggered for us. Number 3 is the routine. So when we begin craving something, we then carry out a routine. This is what we typically know as a habit or a habitual action or behavior. And then 4 is the reward. So once the action is carried out, or once we have that habit that we carry forth and do, then we're rewarded by completing that particular behavior. Now, number 5 is the result. Now, this one final element in the habit loop, I actually discovered over the 23+ years that I've been coaching with people, and I've discovered that this really makes a huge difference in whether or not you stick to a habit. And this is the result that you get. So if you're not getting a result quickly, usually, you're more than likely not going to end up creating a new habit because you're just going to stop doing whatever it is that you're trying out. So how are these habit loops formed? How are these habits formed? They're actually formed through what's called neural pathways through 2 parts of the brain. The first part of the brain is through the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex actually looks for patterns anytime that you're doing anything. Absolutely anything. It's looking and searching for patterns. The prefrontal cortex is an energy hog. So what does this mean? It means that it uses blood glucose, or the sugar that's in your brain. This is the reason why we feel so tired whenever we start to do something new, or do something new for longer periods of time. Like we get zapped and we're just like, oh my God, I'm just so tired. That's because your prefrontal cortex was scanning and looking at every single thing that you did that day to find patterns that it could store to make that particular thing habitual the next time that you do it. And the second part of the brain that's associated with habits is called the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia actually stores the patterns that the prefrontal cortex finds. So this in turn, again, helps us to conserve energy because it stores these patterns as a neural pathway. So let's just say that you're learning how to dance and you take a few dance lessons, and during the videos that you watch and the lessons that you take, that prefrontal cortex is actually working on overdrive, trying to find the patterns of that dance to store for you to use later. This is so that you can save energy should you choose to dance again. Now, this same process happens every single time we do something new. Your prefrontal cortex finds the patterns and sends them over to the basal ganglia through a neural pathway called a synapsis. Now, once these same patterns are detected over and over and over again, the prefrontal cortex says to the basal ganglia, hey, basal, you got this? And the basal ganglia is like, yep, I got it. And after a while, the prefrontal cortex is completely out of the picture because the basal ganglia actually says, ooh, got this, got this, got this. And it's 100% habitual. Like if you ask people that have brain damage how to get up and go and get a drink of water, like where the kitchen is or whatever, they're not going to be able to explain it. But if you say, go get a drink of water, they can get up, go to the kitchen, get a glass of water, and do that particular action. That is a habit. But sometimes, especially if you have damage to your brain, you can't explain how to do something, but it's stored in the basal ganglia. So if that part isn't damaged in your brain, you'll be able to do all kinds of habitual things that you've done throughout your life. So when you have this, when you have these neural pathways or these synapses in your brain, these things are 100% run by these neural pathways, and that in turn is actually what we call a habit. So I have a story about this to help you illustrate how all of this works. So I want you to think about a huge dump truck and a grassy meadow that has never been driven on before. Now, I want you to think about, let's just say that as a child, you said a bad word to a sibling and they smacked you across the face. And when they smacked you across the face, you felt hurt, sad, and confused. Well, with that smack, that was the stimulus. All of a sudden, that big dump truck started up, drove across that meadow, and landed on hurt, sad, and confused. So that neural pathway fired from the smack to the emotion of hurt, sad, and confused. So now when you look at that grassy meadow, you can see a faint line of where you started and where you ended up. So that is the beginning of a neural pathway. So now let's just say in high school, you get in a fight with a friend, and let's just say that they smack you across the face. Your brain goes, oh, wait a minute, I remember this. That truck starts up, drives across that meadow, and lands on hurt, sad, and confused. Again, the prefrontal cortex is looking for patterns, and that pattern is smack across the face, the feeling of hurt, sad, and confused. So that neural pathway gets a little bit stronger. Now, fast forward to college. The same things happen. Maybe that you're having a fight with your partner and they lose their temper and they smack you across the face. Again, all of a sudden your basal ganglia is like, oh, I got this. And again, the smack across the face leads you to that hurt, sad, and confused emotion and energy. And again, each time that truck drives over that meadow, that neural pathway or that pathway gets even more ingrained and deeper and even more automatic. Now, let's just say that now you are hiking in the woods with your friends. Okay, years later, hiking in the woods with your friends, you're not paying attention, you're like, oh, look at this, look at that, woohoo. All of a sudden, the person in front of you moves a tree branch out of the way and you don't notice it. And all of a sudden you get smacked across the face from the tree branch. Again, the basal ganglia is like, I got this. Boom. Now you feel hurt, sad, and confused. And you're like, wait, what the fuck just happened? Like, this does not match up what is going on. That's because the smack across the face was the cue for that neural pathway to fire, that habit to fire, for all of a sudden now we feel hurt, sad, and confused. So that truly is that habitual thing. So when those cues happen and those triggers happen, sometimes we have knee-jerk reactions, and this is why, because those neural pathways fire. And again, this is to save energy, to conserve energy. Back in the day, we needed all the energy that we needed so that we could hunt and find food and gather food and survive. And so when we saw that saber-toothed tiger, we just freaking balls to the wall. We are out of here. And again, if we are using all of our energy to scan and to find patterns and everything, we're not going to have the energy to survive. And so this is why These habits that we have are what's called unconscious habits. They're formed through repetition, through these cues and these routines that we carry out. So unconscious habits are part of our everyday living. And again, these things help us to conserve energy. Unconscious habits are like brushing our teeth. They're like how we drive to work, putting on our clothes, taking seconds or third at dinner time, having a second glass of wine after a long day, scrolling through Facebook or Instagram, or even hitting snooze. Now, these unconscious habits can also help us. They can also hurt us. So remember, in the last chapter, we look at the habits and we decided if you felt that your habits were helping you or if they were hurting you. So how do you break a habit when you realize you really want to stop doing something that might be hurting you and you might want to create a new habit? Well, you simply break that neural pathway, okay? So when the trigger happens, that neural pathway fires, taking about a quarter of a second, and then your reaction occurs. So trigger, neural pathway fires, and then your reaction. So to break that neural pathway from firing, there literally is a split second after the stimulus happens that you can choose another response. And when we do this, it's actually called a pattern interrupt. Now, pattern interrupts are when you actually recognize what trigger or that a trigger happened, and then you choose to do something new instead of what you always done. Now, you can choose something new through pre-planning and practice, but the first thing is awareness of, oh, this is a habit that I'm doing that I don't like. I want to try to do something new. So again, I'm going to say this again, you can choose through pre-planning and practice to do something new so that you can create a new habit. So now at this point, you might be thinking, I've tried to create a new habit. I've tried all those 21-day challenges and it just didn't seem to work, and I just couldn't seem to make things stick. So in the next chapter, we're actually going to be looking at the 21-day myth and how to create a habit faster than ever. In the meantime, what I want you to do is I want you to look at your list that you made in the last chapter. And I want you to choose one habit that you feel is hurting you and that you would love to shift. Then head on over to the next lesson. Remember, it only takes a small 1-degree shift to make magic happen and create a life that you are excited about.